Okay, welcome again to our session on educators' perceptions of nonverbal assessment for gifted students with our guest, Mary Pay. And then Mary is a doctoral candidate in Johns Hopkins. Let me give you 1 second. Mary is a PhD candidate at Johns Hopkins University who studies giftedness, talent, and creativity, primarily focusing on East Asia and the United States. She is interested in the identification, measurement, and development of talent and creativity across socio-cultural contexts. In addition to her work in research and evaluation, she also teaches a seminar on creativity to master's students at Johns Hopkins University. Mary, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for contributing to our conference. And without further ado, I'll hand the microphone over to you.
Okay, thank you for hosting and for the kind introduction. So just to give a little bit of background to the sharing today, this is actually part of my dissertation. These themes that I will be discussing were some of the ones that arose in the thematic analysis that are related to creativity. So I will provide a little bit of background from some of the other themes that arose just to contextualize the rest of the work, but I will be trying to maintain the focus today on the themes that were related to these educators' perceptions of creativity. So just to give a little bit of overview to the study we're talking about today. So this was an exploratory work, and there were 13 participants, all who were in-service teachers at the time of the interview. And they were recruited through email lists, through social media advertisements. And I would like to thank the Men's Foundation because they financially supported this study and made it possible to provide these teachers, these participants, with a token Amazon gift card for their time. And so of those 13 participants, we had 5 veteran teachers, so people with more than 10 years of service. We had 3 intermediate teachers, which I defined as 5 to 10 years of service, and 5 novice teachers, so in those first 5 years of their work in education. Although this study was also open to teachers who had retired, none reached out at that time. So these are all currently in service. 9 men, 4 women. And just to emphasize a little bit, they came from all kinds of different teaching contexts. So some were in public schools as, gifted coordinators. Some were working for like a Center for Talented Youth or other programs like CTY where, not necessarily public education, but still hands-on full-time with these students every day. And many of these also had other responsibilities like a coordinator, a facilitator, a counselor, a technology specialist. They just wore so many different hats, and these different experiences were what they brought into the interviews. So the data were collected with semi-structured Zoom interviews during spring, summer 2024. And I'd like to just be clear that this is a conceptual replication of Aladat and Zumberg from 2019. When they were interviewing teachers, what did they think about the cognitive abilities test? And so when I read their study in 2019, it gave me some inspiration based on what I'd observed from teaching pre-service teachers in the creativity seminar. What might people be thinking? What sort of insights can we gain from them? And really just trying to tap into that kind of wealth of knowledge that's there. Excuse me. And so again, this was a thematic analysis, and there were different themes across these interviews, but today we are going to be keeping the focus on the ones related to creativity. So I wasn't originally planning for this to be part of the work, right? I was interested in seeing what might be there, what can I find, what can we learn? But Stan, who was one of the very first teachers I interviewed, and that is a pseudonym, just to be clear, shared this quotation during our conversation. And Stan said, "So sometimes these students' work, it's not like what you see in a math classroom. For example, I see some students' work, which is very typical, and they follow through the standard algebraic expressions and the way to solve the problems. And with some other students, we see methods that I've never seen before or how they even approach the problem. But in the end, they both solve the problems." And so Stan's excitement really started this conversation of, okay, where can we keep digging? What else might we be able to find if we take a look at this NNet together, which is the measure that we looked at? And to just give a little bit of a background, what the teachers were looking at in this interview was the Naglieri nonverbal ability test, and you were using the 3rd edition level F. And I'd like to thank Pearson Assessments for granting access to this measure. And why I chose to use level F is because I needed that specific level. It's for students in about 7th and 8th grade for a different study I was doing. And it was just easier to request, one particular set of materials and ask Pearson to approve, multiple different levels. I wish I had more of a deep reasoning for that, but it was just down to convenience why we went with this particular one. So the NNAT's designed to look at nonverbal abilities through figural reasoning. And it's something that has been really picked up in talent development and talent identification because it might be more useful for or accessible to students who come from culturally, linguistically, economically diverse backgrounds who maybe don't have the verbal abilities yet to do something a bit more traditional. Or it's for students, it's also used in some special education programs just to try and get an understanding of, what are these students' strengths, what might be going on there. And so you can see it used in different school districts. So I'm over on the East Coast. 2 areas that use it near me are Fairfax County in Virginia and Talbot County in Maryland. But if you look across the country, you can see other places where this is being used as well. One thing to be cautioned though, is that the research on, okay, is this effective? Is this appropriate? When, how, where, why should we be using this is a little bit mixed. And so there are some studies that are saying, yes, this is excellent. This is what we need to be doing. This should be part of our multiple measures of identification. And then there are other studies saying, hold off, wait a minute. We need to figure things out a little bit more. And so that's where this study's coming in, going to the teachers, trying to figure out what more is going on there. So just to provide a little bit of a background, there are 4 major categories of questions, and this will help understand some of the themes and the quotations that I share in just a little bit here. But students are asked to do things like pattern completion, for example, and they're typically given 5 options and they have to select the one that they think is the best fit. They may also be asked to reason by analogy. So an example of that one is here, trying to figure out what goes into that, how do you call it, the dash box with the question mark. They might also be asked to do something called serial reasoning. So figuring out, okay, what comes next? Again, you can see how it is queued. They have 5 choices. They need to select what goes there. Or they can do spatial visualization. So how can they manipulate, rotate, figure out what's going on and identify the next piece into this puzzle? So those are the 4 major categories. And what the teachers did for this study is they looked through a copy of the NNAT. So again, the 3rd edition level F, and they thought aloud, or they voiced aloud, what they were observing, what they noticed, what surprised them, what they were thinking, just trying to verbalize what was going on, what did they see. And what was interesting is the teachers would sometimes be talking about themselves. So for example, based on my experience as a gifted, talented coordinator for 7 years, here's what I think. But they also peppered that with, I've administered a similar test like this, and here's how my students reacted, or here's where maybe we ran into trouble, or based on my own experiences, if this teacher was identified for talent development services as a child, here's kind of what's going on there. And that's where the creativity piece kind of comes into this and is why we're here today. So before I get into the 4 creativity related themes, again, just to kind of contextualize the bigger picture of these interviews, some of the other things that came up were similar to the research. These teachers' perceptions were mixed. Some of them were really excited about this. Some were a little bit more hesitant, and some of them maybe fluctuated about their opinions throughout the conversation. One thing that was interesting, we'll dig into this a little bit later, is that they felt that if their students were unfamiliar with this particular type of assessment or this type of figural task, that could spike testing anxiety, and that could cause issues in how well or how accurately the student performed based on what might be expected based on their other previous performances, right? And the teacher's childhood proximity, whether they were identified, a sibling was identified, parent worked in the field, could color their perceptions as well as they were thinking aloud. But really what came out was that they were concerned, okay, we've got this alignment issue maybe going on where, okay, we're giving these students a figural reasoning task, but then they get identified for the program and that's not at all what the program looks like. How do we kind of balance that conflict that's going on? And then this all kind of fit into the broader picture of, okay, they talked about money, they talked about politics and funding and advocacy and this constantly changing landscape. And what really stood out to me was just this deep intrinsic desire to be the absolute best teacher for these students, no matter what the circumstances, no matter what it took. And as also a former classroom teacher myself, that's something that never ceases to inspire me. Just hearing these conversations and what these experiences meant to these people, it's something for which I'm extremely grateful. So getting into the creativity bit here, if you'll reflect on those 4 sample questions I showed a little bit earlier, one thing that popped up for most of the teachers in this study was this test item or this component of this test item reminds me of this other thing. And so some of the things that came up that these teachers mentioned, you can see in these pictures. So things from Minecraft video game to stained glass windows. One teacher became very fixated on this one looks like a flag. Someone else said it looks, like insects or this card game. But what was interesting is how some of the teachers would use these almost as like constraints to help them figure out what was going on and to explain, okay, this might be how my students could fit out. Whereas other teachers would see these things and say, oh, I don't know what to do now here because I can imagine my students would see this. They would take this in a completely different direction. And although based on my years, working with these tests, working with these students, I can anticipate what the answer guide probably says should be correct. If you look at it through this other sort of association or distraction or whatever else is going on in there, actually, here's a couple places where maybe 2 answers could be correct or 3 answers could be correct. And how are students going to come back and think, okay, this is probably the best one, right? Maybe these others are okay, maybe they're not. We've got to figure out what's going on there. And so really what this ties into is that, okay, maybe there are multiple answers going on here. So for example, I don't know if anyone here plays the Connections game from New York Times, where you're trying to make different categories of the provided words. But one thing that struck me and reminded me as I was doing this analysis and thinking about these sharings that these teachers had was there are times when you can argue that there's more than one correct answer, right? And maybe you got there a little bit differently. Maybe you pulled on something a little bit else. Maybe one thing that came through was the bleed through of how thin these pages were and how maybe that could be distracting for a student taking paper pencil version compared to online version, on iPad on screen or whatever. And so Lily, who is one of the veteran teachers, she has more than 3 decades of experience. She said at this question, which I took from the test booklet, there's multiple patterns going on. And I also don't see any answers that match. And the kids who really want to do well, this is where they would raise their hand and call me over and want me to, give them a hint or something. And so Lily was explaining, look, maybe I can see this is right, but what about these other options? What are we doing? How are we going to help students navigate if there are these opportunities for multiple correct responses? Which led to the bigger theme of, okay, if we look at the scoring guide and we look at these score sheets that the students have completed, there may be something underlying those incorrect responses. And one of the other teachers in the study shared this story about how she was talking about a charger. She was trying to get her students to do something with a charger. And it took her quite a few minutes to figure out that her students, when she said charger, immediately thought of the picture on the left. So something to charge your phone, your laptop, whatever. She was trying to get them to think about a plate charger that you might see at, a wedding reception or something like that, and trying to get them to understand that she was shifting them in a different way, that she was trying to get them to think about something else, really kind of highlights, okay, we're talking about a charger. It can refer to multiple things. Yes, okay, if we look at the bigger context, we might be able to figure it out. But how do we navigate that? How do we decide if something is right or wrong if someone interprets this a little bit differently, right? And trying to reframe this idea of, okay, is this correct? Is this incorrect? How are we going to discuss that? And so this brings us to sort of the bigger pieces that brought up here, sort of these challenges of creativity in the classroom, things that I've seen, teaching these master's students about convergent thinking, divergent thinking, these different theories, these different approaches, all that kind of stuff. And so Erin summed this up pretty neatly. So Erin's an intermediate service teacher, so again, those 5 to 10 years, who was identified for talent development services as a child. And Erin said, so as a kid, I would be like, well, I can make this pattern. I can make this beautiful art. I can make this like this, and it would be different. And that's not what these booklets are asking you for, which is always very sad because that's a kid that's really thinking outside the box, wanting to express their creativity. But that is not what this is looking for in this question. And so Erin's comment highlights, okay, we're trying to set children up, to exercise that divergent thinking, be courageous to be innovative, trying to make sure that they're prepared to go into the world, think outside of the box, be excited with different things, follow all these different cues into their interests, into their curiosity, into their creativity. But we're pulling them back into this environment here where that's not what's being asked. And how are we going to try and balance that out? Sort of how do we teach them not only to think, divergently, but prepare them for a world that might expect them to mostly focus on their convergent thinking skills. And what was interesting is the teachers also highlighted how they feel this push and pull, sometimes in their professional roles as well, and it's not just students. And Amber, who is also an intermediate teacher and one of the ones just doing so many different things, from different coordinator roles to administrative roles to teaching responsibilities, everything. And Amber said, we're always learning, we're always tweaking, and there's that flexibility you have to have because you want to be the most fair to everyone. And so we often think about this sort of push and pull between how can we help students be creative and prepare them for this world that's not necessarily going to encourage that, while we're also dealing with that, ourselves, right? And so as we think about this a little bit more back to the NNAT, back to evaluation, towards identifying students for services, Erin then continued to say, I think that the students are aware when they have the opportunities to be creative, to show what they know, and other ways to go deeper and farther and really get into something. And so when they get back in that really standardized test box, that's so, so hard for them. And she wanted to say that, she wished this weren't the case, that she can make things different. But unfortunately, that's the reality of the situation that these students are in, based on her years of experience, as a student, as a teacher, in all these different roles. What was interesting, though, is if we look at some of the other teachers, in particular, the ones who were working in these not public, just not traditional classroom settings, let me put it that way, is one of these teachers who was a novice and really focuses on that communication and collaboration piece to try and help students, be happy, be healthy, be successful, she was explaining these different ways that students might be able to, complete their evaluation or assessment task, right? And she was saying there's these different ways these can do it. There's these different ways that I'm open to doing it. And there's trying to think, how can we strike that balance, right? Because there are times when we will be able to give them those opportunities. And there are times where they're going to have to be squished into that box a little bit. Where do we find that sweet spot so they're prepared for both while, working towards that world that people are trying to create and, really value that creativity, promote that curiosity, not have a lot of those sort of cooling off moments, those, killing creativity softly moments. We think about Rambagetto, Ken Robinson. How do we really bring this all together? And so the summary of these themes was that, okay, there are these opportunities for these multiple correct responsibilities, and they could be from some kind of conflict between, okay, we've got these convergent thinking skills, we've got these divergent thinking skills. How are students navigating them in the testing environment? And thinking, okay, what are some of the bigger factors that could be going into this? And asking the bigger questions when we think about misidentification, when we think about incorrect responses, are we actually thinking about multiple correct responses, and how are we preparing students for those kinds of situations? And so that one thing, a couple of things that's curious, if we could take an extra minute or two here, is based on your own educational experiences, where are other places where maybe we need some help in navigating these situations, right? Like these teachers described in the test or in their professional environments or with their students, where, okay, maybe this isn't the time where creativity and innovation are going to be appreciated. How do we help people through that? Or is there an experience like that Charger example where a misunderstanding created a larger scale confusion and it took that intentionality to go into there and try and figure out what's going on? So I see we are right at 2 o'clock. So if people wanted to stay a minute and chat or put that in the chat box or just take it and think about it later, anything is okay. But thank you so much for taking the time to listen, to engage. My email is here if you wish to connect offline. But thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you sharing your data and insight, especially on the balance between divergent and convergent thinking in both the testing and classroom environment. Those were like very, very important knowledge and information. So we have a closing session at 12:15 in the main room, but until now, I can stay here if you have a couple questions for Mary. So please go ahead because there's nothing in the chat. So just please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your questions if you wish. Okay, so until some question comes, I think I have also administered nonverbal intelligence test, the Raven standard progressive matrices, and then I have also some challenges with gifted students who want to have who want to come up with several explanations, several paths to solve the problem. So I really appreciate your effort to share this like in an academic setting and let people know that this may create some, I think it may create some disalignment problems between the testing and the activities as well, because you study creativity, you practice with your students about creativity in the class, but when you are identifying them, if you focus more on the convergent thinking, I think that first of all creates a disalignment. So that was kind of what stood out for me.
Mary, I'd also like to say we have created Curiosity to Create as a LLC, and this is established to help teachers modify their existing lesson plans to put joy back into the classroom and also liberate the teachers from having all the answers and inspire the students. So at the end of the day, what we realize now is we need to modify the programs, not just for early LED, mid-range, and high school, but for the gifted. And so we're taking what we've done now, and I guess, Susan, you're going to be helping us a little bit, I understand.
Yes.
Really modify these to be able to have it be applicable and relevant for the gifted population. And I think our CEO of the company had gone to a conference on the West Coast in the last 2 months, and she said they were the most inspiring participants that she's ever been in a room with. So thank you. I just was texting her before I wish you were in this session. So I look forward to sharing it with her. So thank you for your work.
Thank you. And I was just taking a note. You said it's called Curiosity to Create.
Yes, please look at our website. And I'd appreciate feedback, but it's Curiosity with a 2, the number, in an upside down light bulb, create. CREAT, and we came up with a create method. And again, Katie, having almost 25 years in teaching, this was her passion, and it was kind of the next generation of the Driscoll Foundation's work in curiosity. And again, it's really more not funding other people's projects, but creating something that we can own and be proud of, and think about after-school programs, summer programs, and also in the classroom, but more to put joy back into the classroom, which obviously after the pandemic is missing for so many.
Oh, thank you. I'll check that out. And just your comment,
Yes.
joy back in the classroom.
Yes,
That really,
thank you.
that's,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I could not say anything better than that.
So I just want to go back to the conversation around assessments, because that's always been the issue, especially in programs gifted, talented, and creative. And so you ask yourself, what is your programming? What's the curriculum? And what's the mismatch for the assessments? And I always love the work that Robert Sternberg was doing to change the assessments at the university level, knowing that you had to start there to start making a difference all the way down to elementary school in those mismatch. And it's a mismatch of what society thinks is important. And so thanks for that, piece of thoughtfulness, because ask teachers and they'll tell you.
Exactly. Exactly. By the way, Nathan put a note in the chat saying that perhaps there is an argument for inviting students to conduct an intrapersonal cost-benefit analysis to determine the appropriateness or risk-reward calculation of going divergent versus giving the educator or boss what we think they might want to, etc. So, right.
That's fabulous.
I agree. I think one thing that stood out to me in these interviews, it wasn't really touched on here because it was more kind of on the other themes, but was the number of times these participants said, "Thank you for coming to us," you know, talking with us, not about us. And I think, I'm sorry, I didn't catch the name. Nathan's comment, okay, yeah, going right, you know, to the students, to the individuals, same thing. Talking with them, not about them, is such an important and powerful piece.
Of course. They are the leaders of the programs, I think, the teachers, leaders in the classroom. Any other question or comment for Mary? No?
Just
Okay.
thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
It was really excellent. Thank you
Thank you.
so much. Having
Thank you.
taught gifted kids, I totally on the same page. Just amazing.
you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're right about all that love and care. Totally right about that.
So thank you again, Mary. Thanks to our participants. And Mary, if you wish to get the recording, just let me know and I will just convey it to you. Then,
Okay, thank you.
everybody, we will see you in
Excellent.
the main room.
All right. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Take care.